Hello, everyone. Welcome to Political Animals, Explorations of the Political Across the Ages. This event was conceived as a collaboration between between Simon Fraser University and the SNF Centre for Hellenic Studies and the University of Athens and my colleague Yorgos Politis at the Philosophy, Politics and Economy Laboratory. It's an event that was not meant to be online. We were supposed to be on an island, on the island of Lesbos, and we were supposed to be talking about scholarship, bringing together teachers and students interested in the political, while also having the time to reflect and converse about our ideas. However, the pandemic happened. The pandemic, which is not exactly apolitical for all that it might appear like a biological phenomenon. It has a very clear, very profound political implications, and we had to make adjustments. Before we proceed with a bit more about this event and with introductions of the panelists for today, I would like to just go through some basic sort of housekeeping for how we're going to proceed today. So if I may ask you to be aware that this is a recorded event. We will have questions submitted to a Q&A. And people who are participants can also raise their hand in order to ask questions. We ask, of course, that we're all kind and respectful. I know we're past the age when professors used to eviscerate other colleagues in conferences and students in brutal fashion, but in general, let's be mindful of the need for basic respect. And if you have feedback, or other questions that cannot be discussed during this and tomorrow's panel, but you think would be of interest to you and you think that you could get more out of us, then please address them to hellenic@sfu.ca, and we will be very happy to direct them to whoever among our participants would be the most appropriate person to engage with. So I'm going to get past the PowerPoint world, and so that before we introduce our panel, I present a few conceptual issues about this, and maybe something about the background. When I started thinking about this event, I thought of it as a continuation from an event that took place last year in Lesbos, where we had academics throughout North America and Europe engaging at a pretty theoretical level about anything from sovereignty, aesthetics, place, in fairly global contexts. It was a very successful event. The videos and recordings have been followed by people, but mostly scholars. And one of the things that I thought that could be added to the format is engagement with students. In my own personal experience, one of the most fulfilling some of the most fulfilling relationships that I was able to construct in academia have been with my students. And in a place like SFU, where I'm the lone Byzantinist, the community that you create is with your students. And in many ways, this event was conceived as an opportunity to bring students together with active scholars in the field and in established institutions. And in the past few years, I had an opportunity to reconnect with my old friend from school days, Yorgos Politis, who from his own position at the University of Athens was having very much similar concerns and questions. And for all that we exist in very different academic worlds, I think we're both fairly robust political animals, thinking consistently about politics and interested in different ways of approaching the subject. Yorgos then introduced me to Kostis Repapis at Goldsmiths. And over lunch, these things happen often in such circumstances, we started fleshing out how we can go forward. For me, it was a natural question to go towards politics. I have a background in political science. I ended up in Byzantium in circuitous ways. Through my own work, I had some real concerns about how can I imagine politics in a place where that I can only access through limited sources. So today is an opportunity for those of us who deal with the ancient world to talk about how we go about thinking politically. And the whole event is hopefully an opportunity for modern thinking about politics. And by modern, I mean, from 16th century onwards. The pre-modern to meet for history and theory, for material culture, for philosophy to come together and hopefully create some sort of cross-pollination. I'm not going to talk for much longer. I would like to start introducing our panelists for today and explain a bit of the format for this panel. We're gonna have short introductions, about 5 minutes long, from each of the presenters of their paper. I mean, the papers have been pre-circulated, so hopefully we've come here having done our homework, but framing the paper, where does this paper come from? What are some central concerns addressed in it? And after that, we will have a conversation that will be open to the rest of the panelists and participants, and hopefully our attendees. I ask for your indulgence because this is my first time trying to moderate from a computer keyboard and screen, but hopefully we can get as many questions in. What I will try to do is, after each 5-minute presentation, have about 10 minutes and a bit of conversation. If you don't get to ask a question on a given panel, please keep it, because we have time to continue afterwards as we bring everything together. So we should have ample time for a proper discussion. So without further ado, let me present our participants by, there is no specific hierarchical order, by order of presentation in of paper. And I will start with Yovanovich, who is joining us from Belgrade right now. Jovana is a student in the history department at Simon Fraser University and an affiliate and member of the SNF Centre for Hellenic Studies, an essential member of our team here in Vancouver, who has a background in history from the University of Belgrade, but has a clear philological interests that inflect much of her work, and the paper that she will present today. Jovana finds herself at a crossroads, as no pressure here, as she needs to decide if she's going to go in one direction with her PhD or another, if her project will become modern reception of Byzantium, or if Mavropoulos and other letter writers of the 11th and other Byzantine centuries are going to drag her back into the Middle Ages. it's an exciting choice to make, but we're not going to expand on that right now. After Jovana, I'll introduce Tiffany van Wijnpoop, who's an MA student at Simon Fraser University at the History Department, the SNF Centre for Hellenic Studies, who came to Byzantium from a very different world. Her BA is in health sciences, and somehow was lured into the Middle Ages by way of Hellenic Studies classes. She is working on her MA thesis on the 10th century Book of Ceremonies by the bookish, erudite Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos. And I don't want to prejudge it, but he's doing pretty interesting work with this text, and I think this is what we will be discussing today. Now, Fotini Kondili, I think I met rather late, only last fall at the Byzantine Studies conference. She's now assistant or associate. What is the status right now? Assistant? Oh, okay.
I just became associate.
Oh, congratulations. An associate professor in Byzantine in art and archaeology at the University of Virginia, who focuses on Byzantine and Frankish material culture, the construction of Byzantine spaces, households, and in general, the world of the non-elites, as you will also see in her paper and discussion today. She's currently writing her monograph on late Byzantine rural societies, socioeconomic and spatial organization of non-elite groups, and on the impact of global demographics, read pandemics, on those communities. Going on, we have Alex Yovanovich, who received his PhD from Simon Fraser University, the History Department, and the SNF Centre for Hellenic Studies this past summer, and came to us from the University of Belgrade with a background in classics, both at the BA and MA level. Alex works on, if you want to use a term, on the public sphere of the Nicene Empire, so 13th century exilic Byzantium, if you wish. But his interests are by no means restricted to that. He has a broader Mediterranean kind of concern, and exploring the place of what you could call Roman medieval culture in the broader Mediterranean world. Alex Grammatikos holds his PhD from Carleton by way of York and SFU as previous stops in the experience, and works on British Romanticism and early 19th century Greek culture, intersections of Greece, ideas of Greece, and British literary production, and the production by way of the British literary production of a notion of Greece too, for both global audiences, but also for the Greeks themselves. And also has broader interests on conceptions of gender in this this body of literary work. I guess that leaves myself. I'm a professor of history, of Byzantine history at the Department of Humanities at Simon Fraser University. I ended up at SFU after doing my PhD at the University of Michigan, and my MA studies in the UK. My first degree, however, is indeed in political science, and in a perhaps perverse kind of way, I ended up in Byzantium by way of my interest in bureaucracies. I don't know how many people find bureaucracies fascinating and decide the rest of their lives on the basis of that, but that was my experience. My work is mainly focused on Middle Byzantine political, social, and intellectual history, so 8th to 12th centuries, roughly speaking. Occasionally, I publish outside this, these general chronological parameters. Up to now, I have worked fairly extensively with historical texts and the ways in which those historical texts construct political spaces and political debate in Byzantium in this period. So with that introduction out of the way, I think I would direct our attention to Yovana, who will need to unmute herself, or maybe I can do that myself. No.
Hello.
And give her the time to discuss her paper, and then we will go into questions. Yes.
Thank you for this introduction and for the invitation to something that I've clearly never done before in my life, not even similarly, not even close. And I think so far, even though this is just the beginning, it is quite interesting to be able to read and watch and listen to other people's works, and then take the time to think about this, take the time to actually consider questions and answers and ways in which you can analyze stuff, and then come back to have a chat. Ideally, it will be in Molivos, but this is also, at least it's comfortable and fine. So I'm calling in from Belgrade, where I got, due to my current or maybe previous research path, which was connected to the ways we in the Balkans, mostly in the places where Byzantium used to be, understand what Byzantium is through education, through elementary and high school education, and then things happened, and I ended up having to stay in one place, not being able to go around and do my research, which left me with some time to think back and to think about Byzantium proper, as in how do I understand Byzantium and how I read the sources and texts. So I went back to the project that I've begun sometimes in September or August last year, which is the one of letters. And it is basically a question that somewhat was around my mind from the beginning of my MA, I think, from the end of my BA studies and from the beginning of my MA, when I started working on Giannis Mavropoulos, who was an exiled intellectual from the 11th century. And his letters, his collection of letters is a very peculiar text. I remember reading it for the first time and thinking that if someone wanted to leave messages, if someone wanted to leave facts about their life, this is a very strange way to do this, because it's a collection of short stories or excerpts that don't really give you a clear idea of what's going on per se in someone's life, but they give you an emotion or a feeling more than facts. And when you, from that point onwards, when I started reading other collections, not separate letters, especially not very popular letters that are quoted a lot in different historical works and in different monographs, but when you read the collections of letters, I felt like there is this similarity, the odd similarity of things being left out, things being composed in a very specific way, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And I felt like it was more about the emotions and more about someone's intentions that are not clear enough, that are arranged to say something that I might not understand, but that there's something into it. So I started the research last year, where I wanted to look into different collections of letters, especially from the 9th century, the late 9th century, beginning of 10th century onwards, when they become very popular again in Byzantium. So you have letters that are separate, that are there to send some kind of a specific message, saying, I need this much of that, or I need you to bring me Arby's or gold or whatever, very specific to their needs at that point is. But there are collections of letters that sometimes just that are copied and circulated that would just sometimes send different emotions about events that are not quite clear to us. So I guess that my main question was, what did this genre tell us? As in, when you read a history, you open up a book, a history of whomever, say, I don't know, Athens, Psilos, whomever, you open a book and you expect to find a narration about the past. You expect to learn something that has happened in the past, but you know what you're reading. There is some kind of a specific expectation behind it. And I think that my main question was, what was the expectation of the Byzantine audience when they read letter collections? If anyone read them in a specific order as they were composed and as we have them today. And with that question, I started analyzing all of the authors of the mid-Byzantine period, and the striking similarity was that almost all of them were exiled. I'm not quite sure about the three of them, as in we know that they were somehow removed from their office. We know that there was some kind of turmoil, that there was something going on, but there are debates about the actual exiles or their authorship of the letters. So with that, I'm left with Simeon of Magistros, who might have been the metaphrast who composed the letters. He might have been someone else. And because we're not quite sure what the destiny and who the author is, we're not quite sure how to understand the letters. The Theodore of Cyzicus and Aristos of Caesarea, the three ones that all have engaged into serious political action and led some kind of debates and arguments with the current establishment, so to say. But I've left them out just in case that I might have misread something, and focus on the other ones, which are 11 in total. And I also excluded the four biggest collections, which are all the collections of the exiled intellectuals and religious figures of the time. I've excluded them because they're huge, not because they don't fit the paradigm, but I focused on the somewhat less popular ones just to see if there is the message of exile clearly expressed through them. And so far, I found some striking similarities. So to not go overboard, I'm going to leave the floor to you for any questions and comments.
So to get us started, so with your paper, you take these collections and you make a claim that we have a tradition that goes way back before the Byzantine period of letter writing as a form of critique. And letter collections in that sense, not just as hodgepodges of sort of stylistic curia of exciting writing that we put together because this is a good writer and posterity needs some good writing, but as intentional texts. If I may ask one question, and then we can start seeing what questions there are from the panel and from other attendees. The one thing that comes up the moment you start talking about a Roman tradition that goes back to early imperial years is this problem of time with our conception of Byzantine history. This idea that traditions might last for millennia and that ways of thinking and doing might be similar across times, which in our periodizations in school, we learn are very different periods. How do you deal with questions like that when trying to think about how politics is done? You realize it's a broader question. It's not just about you, but in many ways, it's a crucial question for Byzantinists. to you.
Yes, I mean, I feel like there's always some kind of a fusion where it's very important to remember the tradition in a sense that someone remembered it, in a sense that this is like a generated, it's generated knowledge, but also in a sense where times obviously have changed, and different trends and worries kind of come into play. So I guess that in a sense I could understand that from the point where you had a decline of letters and letter collections in before the 8th century, and then they reemerged, and then they started multiplying. Perhaps this is exactly because of the idea of the tradition being regenerated, reinvented, reappropriated in a sense, and serve a specific purpose. And after the iconoclastic era, after everything that has happened, I think it would make sense.
So can I ask our panelists or attendees if there are some questions on the paper, or should I can go on with my questions for quite a while, but I don't want to monopolize this. And I wonder whether we could have a gallery view so that I can also see the rest of the panel and the reactions. Yes. So Alex? Yes.
Yeah, so thanks for the paper, Yovanovich, by the way. It was really cool to listen to it. So I have a question about the very people who kind of collected the collections, right? Do you see any difference when it comes to political agency of the collector this time? Is there a different pattern when you have the author themselves compiling the letters and putting them into a collection in a specific way, what, for example, Mavropoulos did, I guess, versus I'm thinking of Theodoros II Lascaris' letters, right? That were put together by Acropolites with a whole little intro, like, oh, this is for you, my good student, and so on and so forth. So my take is, Acropolites is actually trying to establish his own kind of proximity to the court or something. But then again, I'm actually curious, how do you see the two differently leveraged kind of collections, right? One's by the authors and one's by people who knew the authors in a way.
I love the question, and this is something that I was thinking about, but it's not always clear. As we don't, Mavropoulos is wonderful because he gives us a very direct, very elaborate introduction into what he's doing and what someone is writing or not writing. But we don't always get to see that as upfront as we do with Mavropoulos. So sometimes, mostly with the letter collections that I've been reading so far, we had the authors themselves, or somewhat, or their very close associates, who, as far as I can remember, are not very prominent figures. But it is something that I would definitely look into a bit more closely, because it's a very good question, because it shows the intention. And especially if we think about this as a way to present someone as a political dissident of some sort, or a political thinker of some sort, who dared to question the matters in the state in which he lived, then it has a new layer on it.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks.
Sorry, I'm muted. Fotini?
So, Giovanna, thank you very much for your paper. I was very impressed with your very careful and close reading of the letters. When I started watching your talk, I thought everything would be about human authority versus the authority of Christ. So you mentioned this a little bit in the beginning with Theodore of Studios. So I thought this is where we're going with this, which is, of course, it is a political commentary, but to me at least, it's an indirect way to talk about the emperor and the way he rules, simply because, the competition is Christ. So, it is a little bit of an uneven political relationship. But then later, you mentioned when you start talking about how this, the value of the use of free speech is so consistent in these letters, you actually provide us with a very different example where you say that one of your letter writers mentions that the way that they view Byzantium as a political formation that separates it from formations in Asia and the idea of despotism is the power to say no. And, you know, for me, that was a revelation. I think this is such a huge statement coming from a Byzantine talking about Byzantine political formation. So I would love to hear a little bit more your opinion about that statement and how you viewed it as a commentary of a Byzantine talking about Byzantium as an empire.
Well, for me, I have to admit that I didn't dwell upon this too much. It was, so when you have 11 plus manuscripts, I kind of had to just run through them to check everything that I had on my list, being very excited with such formulations as the one that you've mentioned. But I understood it completely as a commentary on the foundations that are quite Roman and that are quite democratic in their essence within Byzantium, where Byzantine authors understand themselves and express themselves as participants of this system. And then the flirtation with Asia. I mean, the play with Asia that appears in certain instances in letters, and I would say even more history than letters. It doesn't really appear that much in the letters so far. Is something that's just well, I feel like a useful contrast to amplify the point of the Roman polity that they have, the freedoms that they had.
I think that, you know, considering where we're going, where the discussion on political formation is going in Byzantine studies, that we, in a way, rediscover how the Byzantines thought about rulership and authority, and that it might be far more participatory as we had thought about maybe 20 years ago. For me, you know, listening to that part of your talk made me feel that this was a very strong argument for that kind of participatory way of running an empire that is so well experienced by the Byzantines that, you know, it makes it to this letter as a way to criticize but also envision what Byzantium should be.
I would agree completely. And the fact that someone recognized this, and I'm fairly certain that someone did, so there was a need to multiply this kind of books. I prefer the word like, I prefer to focus on a collection as a book than as just like a random scrapbook of different letters and someone's correspondence. So someone recognized this idea and they needed to circulate this. You had manuscripts that ended up in different places. We can't completely trace them and figure out if they were reproduced or copied outside of the place they originated. Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. But there was an audience that was interested about hearing, thinking, and reading about the ways someone challenged the authorities and someone participated in political life.
Thank you, Yovanovich. Thanks. That was very interesting.
I think that this idea of the participatory Byzantium and the idea of being able to say no is something that is going to be picked up by other papers. I mean, Fotini, for that matter, it might be what you're building, you yourself are building from the bottom up. Just to add an example that comes straight from the paper that I submitted, there is this interesting comment in a document in a tacticon, a document about running war, where the comment is, we are not like the Scythians, where brutality leads to submission. We are rational human beings and we need to be convinced. So there is this long tradition, as correctly pointed out by Fotini, neglected in many ways in Byzantine studies, that we will be talking about more extensively today. So to move things along, and knowing that if there are more questions, we can bring them into a broader discussion at the very end, I'll hand us over to Tiffany Van Vinkoop, who will present on ritual geographies and ceremonial time, the Book of Ceremonies as a blueprint for political action. Floor is yours.
Excellent, thank you so much. And yeah, thank you everyone for being here. Obviously this is unusual, but we are doing our best. So, I really actually, one word that stood out for me from Yovanov's presentation that nicely kind of transitions to mine is this idea of expectation. So my paper kind of came to being when I started reading Michael Italiatis's history of the Byzantine state and getting to Michael V and his procession around the Easter ceremonial. And so what stood out for me was not necessarily the political actions of the people following his attempted power grab, but rather how he was using the ceremonies around Easter and in what is recorded in the history, the ceremony of the grand procession of the Easter Sunday after Easter, Sunday following Easter, and how he used that procession as a means of kind of gauging popular opinion, or the people were favorably disposed towards him, and consequently he decided to act accordingly. So for me, I had been looking at ceremonies originally, so anything that is ceremonial or processional, I get very excited. And yes, I do apologize to anyone who had actually watched the video and how long I rambled on about ceremonies. So yes, please stop me now as well if the same thing occurs. So yeah, I got very excited seeing these ceremonies and seeing these ceremonies as a means of interaction between the emperor and the people in this regard, which led to this moment, this very unusual moment of, yeah, political agency by the people. So yeah, thinking on this foundation then, my paper kind of builds upon this ongoing discussion that we're having in Byzantium about the political agency of the people and their involvement in the Byzantine state. And so I decided to kind of reconstruct in many ways what Michael's logic may have been regarding this grand procession in the week following Easter, and the different ways that he might have been able to use ceremonies, and especially the ceremonies following up to this Easter, Sunday following Easter, and the ceremonies that occurred after, which were mainly city-focused and secular in nature, and how he might have been hoping to use these as a means of consolidating power. So yeah, my paper ultimately was hoping to ask these questions about how these politically motivated actors could use these spaces and times prescribed in a ritualized ceremonial state in that regard for these moments of political action. And that's where then my paper finds its foundation in the 10th century Book of Ceremonies, which has all of these different ritualized actions recorded from the 10th century. And so thinking about that in an 11th century context, with the caveats, of course, that ceremonies change and evolve over time in the Byzantine state. So in that regard, then my presentation was kind of divided into two parts. I had the Easter ceremonies more in the first half, which was kind of a consolidated summary of what I had presented last fall at the Byzantine Studies Conference, where I looked much more in depth at all these different 13 ceremonies in total that would have occurred prior to the Sunday following Easter, and looked at these not just as these ritualized actions between emperor and the people, but rather as these opportunities for dialogue and these opportunities that the people would have been aware of, and Michael also could have been aware of as means of communication. So yeah, I summarized that a little bit more in this presentation. And then I also I was thinking in terms of what would have happened after. If Michael's coup, power grab rather, would have been successful, what would these first days have looked like of his new regime, and how could he have continued to potentially use the ceremonial calendar projecting forward into May of 1042 to consolidate his new regime. And so in that regards, I moved the ceremonial calendar forward and began looking at these city-focused secular ceremonies, such as the reception of the Gold Hippodrome Festival, the celebration of the city on May 11th, the anniversary of the city, Ascension Day, and then finally the celebration of Constantine. Because May is a very kind of imperial ceremonial calendar, if I can generalize in that regard. So in that regard, it would be very convenient for Michael to have begun his new rule in this space. So yeah, ultimately I'm beginning to explore all these different ways that we can think about ceremonies, not just as ritualized performances, but as, spaces for dialogue, how we can blend this idea of public and private, as well as the emperor and other politically motivated actors using these spaces in a weaponized manner. So that is my paper.
Thank you very much. Turning back to gallery view. Just as a bit of background on the book of Ceremonies, we're talking about two rather thick volumes in their modern edition for the non-Byzantinists here, of very detailed prescriptions on what should happen on different days in Constantinople's ceremonial calendar. So this is not exactly a page turner. It can be a fairly technical document, but your attempt here is to not only make sense of that document, but see how it can interface with other historical sources. Would you like to talk perhaps a bit more about that kind of intersection of the manual for doing and let's say the historical texts and your experience of working with the two of them together? And then hopefully we can get questions from panelists and attendees.
Yeah. So what also stood out in the example of Michael and his grand procession following Easter is that the movements that we have recorded in Taliadis's history very much match the ceremonial prescriptions of the Book of Ceremonies, which is not surprising, but it is very interesting then to think about the ceremonial memory that exists in Constantinople and how applicable that would be throughout different centuries. So obviously changes would have occurred with physical locations. For example, there's certain areas of the palace that are mentioned in the 10th century Book of Ceremonies that would not have existed in Michael's time. But thinking about the things that do persist throughout the centuries from this theoretical handbook to now the historical reality does begin to show what kind of expectations existed for these interactions, and how then, if the ceremonies had to change from the Book of Ceremonies to the political realities of later time periods, what sorts of emphasis might have existed for these spaces, and what sort of ideas might have the people wanted, or what sort of ways would these interactions have continued in a way that might have been different from the ceremonial template in the 10th century, but still retained the ideas and the motivations in a political reality later on.
I don't have raised hands or questions. Alex Grammatikos.
Hi. I don't, it's small view anyway. I really enjoyed your paper, Tiffany, as I've told you already. I can actually probably lower my hand while I speak. All to say that, I think because I've been thinking about these kinds of things recently too, there's something, of course, very performative about Michael V coming out, and I really liked I liked is the way that you kind of speculated about what ceremonies there were during the dates, in April and May, and how he could have used those, how he could have exploited those. And I'm all to say, my question is, you talked about urban riot, and I wonder, in kind of this speculative mode, and I don't know if you touched upon it in your paper, and if so, sorry for repeating my question, but what went wrong for Michael? What are the kinds of things that could have gone wrong for Michael? If you could speculate about that, how did he misstep in kind of performing for the public? What missteps may he have taken?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's especially in Italiadis, how Italiadis describes it is kind of this, he seems to be more self-aggrandizing than he realizes, and seems to misread what exactly these reactions to ceremonies mean. At least that is how Italiadis spells it out, because they discuss the loyalty towards Zoe for the people, and how this betrayal to the people then seemed to be such a misstep, and that Michael then had elevated his own standing of himself, not realizing that this ceremonial reaction might not necessarily have been to him, or at least that same loyalty then would have existed. But ultimately what my paper is trying to do is to not necessarily give this is why he succeeded. Yes, it's more thinking about these mechanisms of how we can use ceremonies as a means of bringing together these different politically motivated actors, and thinking about how they would have used these spaces and times to communicate. So it's not a step-by-step handbook of, yes, he did this and then that and then that, and it went perfectly, because obviously it did not.
Yeah.
But I think especially from how we are reading the interpretation from Italiadis and Scalizzis as well, kind of supplementary, is that he misread his own popularity in the eyes of the people, and misread how the people were so endeared to Zoe, be it because of her imperial legacy, or even just, the distribution of wealth that she had among the people.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much.
Dimitri, you are muted.
As I pass this to Alex and then to Fotini, I would like to just point out that the idea that the emperor has to read the people in and of itself is fascinating. And it introduces us to a really problematic question that none of us have addressed in the field, which is public opinion in Byzantium. Any PhDs who would like to study this, please. This is a pretty interesting field. So, Alex?
Yeah, well, thanks, Tiffany. So you mentioned ceremonial memory in your little intro. And I know you went through Pseudokodinos, so I'm not pushing for late Byzantium because I do late Byzantium exclusively. So, but I'm just thinking, because you mentioned that you're curious about the ways in which ceremonies might have changed or not have changed throughout the time period. And again, I know you did not dwell on Pseudokodinos as much as you did on the Book of Ceremonies. But have you noticed the amount of things that have not changed in a way? And what does this tell you about the durability of the specific ceremonial institutions in the Byzantine state, right? And to kind of Alex's point, like of all performativity of ceremonial, and then how it's hard to change things once they're kind of set in stone, basically. So if you notice any kind of similarities, because I know other scholars just usually pointed out like, oh, things have not changed as much, or things have changed much, but then they have kind of opposing opinions on it. So that would be the question.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing that I have thought about, especially when I was going through the Pseudokodinos, of course, because there are references in that document from the 14th century to the 10th century ceremonies. And yes, cross-referencing like, yes, they are doing the similar thing. One tiny micro example that stands out in my head talking about these differences and how things might have changed is thinking about the Great Thursday of Easter. So that would have been the Last Supper biblically. I think in the 14th century, the emperor does in fact wash other people's feet. this does not occur in the 10th century. There is still kind of a layer of separation. He is visiting the homes of the lepers, but we do not have the same recording that he is, you know, being submissive in the forms of Christ type of thing. So that's an example where I'm like, oh, I wonder what has occurred in, you know, the imperial memory that all of a sudden this change is occurring. Is this, yes, indicative of kind of a more liturgical spin on the role of the emperor in the 14th century as opposed to the 10th and things like that. Now, obviously that's a tiny micro example and I don't want to, yes, speculate too far, of course, but it's kind of, it is ideas like that that I do want to keep in mind as, yeah, continuing going through the Book of Ceremonies and the Pseudo-Codinos and kind of, yeah, how is the imperial memory being shifted and changed and, yeah, the performative aspect changing through all of this. I think it's fascinating for sure. And the Pseudo-Codinos is definitely the funner document for those of you who have not, yes, if you want to get into ceremonies, Pseudo-Codinos, start there.
So with that suggestion for further reading, light reading on the beach, I'll remind our participants that the Q&A function allows for people who might be shyer in submitting their voices to submit written questions, and I'll pass the baton to Fotini.
Tiffany, thank you for this. I want to start by saying how much I enjoyed and I appreciate the fact that you are so willing to experiment and play with the text itself and ask the what if question. And I say this for, you know, the Byzantinists in the room and for the non-Byzantinists in the room, that sometimes we appear to the text as something very sacred and we don't dare to ask this what if question. So I think, you know, that on its own, to me at least, I valued this as a great way of thinking about Byzantine authority. I want to start by highlighting some of the things that I think you did so well, and you created such a contribution for us with your paper, and then, you know, end up this comment with a question actually. So of course, as an archaeologist, you know, I loved your paper because you wanted to place all of these activities and this political dialogue in specific places, not only in the palace, but within the city. And I think one of the things that it's so valuable in your own work is that you focus our attention to the idea of temporality of the spaces themselves. So yes, we all know that, for example, the Hippodrome was a space where the people of the city and the emperor met, but on different occasions, that occasion kind of informed the dialogue that these groups would have. So it's very different when emperor and people meet after an emperor has come from a campaign. And it's very different in an occasion like Michael trying to establish his authority. So, you know, that, I thought that was a wonderful thing that you highlighted in your paper. The other thing, and, you know, Dimitris kind of talked about it with public opinion, has to do with reception. We spend a lot of time thinking about political propaganda and political agendas. Do we kind of forget to ask the question, is the message being received? Is the message being understood? And in this case, you know, you take us to all the effort that Michael did and all the money he spent, and connect your paper very well with Alexander Grammatikos' paper on peasantry and performance of imperial authority. But at the end, you know, from what we know, Michael's message was not received. He did fail. I think, you know, the other thing is that, you know, I had never thought about the timing so deliberately. And, you know, now I'm tempted to go and see what happened every year in Byzantium in the months of April and May. Because, you know, you do achieve something that at least I was not aware of, that, you know, you do have these months in the calendar year where you do get these opportunities to really show off and do it in a way that It's about the benefit of the people. It's about generosity. It's about philanthropy that scores very highly for the emperors. So, I think it would be interesting to see what happens every year in that calendar. In my Byzantine art class, we play this game, what kind of emperor you want to be. And of course, most of my students want to be a Cerberus. I don't know why. So now I can give them the dates and they can try this at home. But it would be interesting to see if we have coronations happening around that year, ambassadors coming at that time of year, because, this is a unique opportunity for this kind of political agenda to unravel. So all of this is just to say how wonderful your paper was and how successful in using a text that so many Byzantines have talked about and actually offering something new. So I just, want to highlight that and congratulate you for doing so. And now my question. So for the question, you did mention a little bit here and in your talk as well about the religious aspect of this performance, especially because it's around Easter and associated with Easter. But then, of course, as you told us in your talk, in May, we have two specific dates that have to do with the celebration of the city itself and the city as a political body. And I'm, of course, talking about the anniversary of the city and Constantine's anniversary. So I wanted to ask you, to invite you to talk to us a little bit about the significance of these days and how Michael, what kind of opportunities they would give Michael to talk about power, since, he comes in such a different way into the throne.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much for these comments and this question, for sure. There's so much. It's very fun, the Book of Ceremonies. There's a lot you can do with it, and I'm very excited to be able to explore it more fully, throughout my MA and whatever comes next. So to get to your question then, to think about like power in these different kind of secular contexts, I always have to kind of rein myself in and not over speculate, because of course both of these occasions would have been excellent for Michael to be like, yes, I'm starting a dynasty. We're celebrating that the city has, been founded, and we're celebrating the founder himself. So kind of these ideas tying together this whole concept of this new idea. And Michael, very much was, although adopted by Zoe and whatever, he came from such a humble background that he is now starting this very much this riches to rags tale that I am so hesitant, of course, because first of all, he didn't celebrate these ceremonies. It didn't happen. But to think about how the people would have perceived, or how the people think about these ceremonies together and think about them as they are in such close proximity of this idea of, what is our Constantinopolitan identity with regards to power and with regards to how the emperor is influencing these power, the idea of power. And so, when thinking about Michael and how he could have potentially been using both of these as, the city with the political body and religion and secular, we can only speculate, of course, but it's very interesting, just, the convenience of it. One thing that I also noticed that I didn't address in the paper at all, but this same year, a former feast, the Feast of Mid Pentecost, which would occur on the Wednesday 4 weeks after Easter, fell exactly on the day of the anniversary of the city. I do not know what that means or how Michael might have used that. And I do not know if there is, some weird interaction going on between it was celebrated as a religious procession earlier in the 10th century, although that changed as well. I have no idea how he would have played with the fact that just conveniently, that timing would have occurred on the same day in 1042, which also goes to your question of, what happened every year? Because Easter, of course, was always moving. So how would it have changed, and how would that have changed the city politic in the fact that, you can have these highly ceremonial, philanthropic pageantry at different times every year. It is not the same calendar date either. So how would that affect campaigns, for example? Like, do you want to be in the city? Do you want to be out of the city? Things like that. sorry, I see Dimitri unmuting.
Oh, yeah,
I am rambling.
No, it's, I'm fairly excited that this generates the conversation, and I'm just always fascinated by how much excitement the Feast of Mid Pentecost can create in someone. So you probably get the prize for the level of excitement, but I'm also mindful of time. So maybe we can leave other follow-up questions and more discussion for later. As we transition to tactical urbanism and grassroots initiatives in Byzantine Athens by Fotini Kondili, which keeps us in the spatial kind of dimension.
Thank you, Dimitri, and thank you, Dimitri, for your invitation and the opportunity to think a little bit about what political action means in Byzantium. I think this is, now that my book on rural communities in the late Byzantine period and how they are resilient, even if the political entity of Byzantium falls, I think I'm moving into cities, but my research continues to be on the social lives and material lives of non-elite, of ordinary people, trying to give them a voice and reinstate them in a way in the historical narrative, because usually in Byzantine studies, they don't seem to be doing much. They're just there in the background of big events, probably trying to pay taxes and suffering under, big landlords and things like that. As you might have heard in my talk, I kind of started with a confession that when I started my work in the Athenian Agora excavations and trying to deal with the amazing and huge material that were excavated from the Byzantine layers of the city, politics was not on my mind. I was just really trying to understand which wall went with which floor and things like that. But what was happening was, these were the years that Greece was really feeling the economic crisis. And of course, as I would take the metro and go downtown Athens to go to our offices, which are in the Stoa of Attalos in the Agora, I would actually witness these groups of Athenians coming together to undertake some projects to beautify or even clean Athens. So, on the one hand, my experience was, I was walking and seeing this in modern Athens and going in the Stoa of Attalos and thinking about Byzantine Athens. Then in the fall, I would return to the University of Virginia and the city of Charlottesville, and I would see a group of citizens trying to advocate for a new bike lane. So, the message was on the wall for me, but at some point, I wanted to use that inspiration and what was happening around me to ask that question about Byzantine Athenians themselves. Did they play any role in creating their own city? Did they have a saying? So, that took me into a study of Byzantine administration, and especially how the empire deals with cities. And of course, I rely on the work of Byzantine historians who, this is their field of expertise. But it seems like that the empire had a very hands-off way of dealing with cities in the provinces. So the emperor and his court would not interfere directly unless there was a huge riot that an emperor would feel threatened by. Of course, he rules through his officials, but the officials that are sent in the provinces usually, have very short appointments. And there's no incentive to actually do something for the city. Most of the infrastructure work we know of actually comes from ecclesiastical officials. In Thebes, for example, the aqueduct is built by ecclesiastical officials. So then the question is, okay, if the emperor doesn't care, his officials are somewhere else, they're not in Athens, usually they're in Thebes. Maybe Choniatis is interested in doing something. Who is doing all these changes that I see archaeologically in the city itself? And we keep thinking about political action as something big, as something very visible, a riot, a revolt. But for me, this is a challenge to expand the way we're thinking about political action and its definition. So for me, providing small-scale infrastructure work, amenities, a public space, a well that is clean for the neighborhood. These are things that, in a way, assume the role of the state, what we think the state should be doing. But it's a small scale, so obviously it's not the state. that leaves us with the people themselves. So, I'm looking at spaces that are public spaces, are open spaces. They can be built, they cannot be built and be just open spaces, but they're spaces of social interaction. This is where the citizens themselves meet, they encounter each other, they socialize, they build up trust, social capital, because if we don't have these spaces, then we're not able to explain at what space and under which conditions, if I want to support a revolt, I will persuade you to join me. So there must be somewhere that we are meeting and we have the opportunity to exchange our opinions, trust each other, learn from each other. So then, this can, if there is need, to manifest in a bigger political action. So on the one hand, I want to present ordinary people as protagonists in the politics of the Byzantine Empire. At the same time, I want to broaden our definition about what political action actually is. So that's a project that's going to take a long time because there's a lot of material in the Agora, but it's a start.
Well, thank you so much for this and for a really compelling paper. I know that as I go into my city's quest, I'll be talking, and Alex with me will be talking to you for these questions. And before I ask for panelists and audience to contribute questions, I want to raise a crucial word that you used both in your paper and right now in your presentation: trust, because there is a. And Yorgos perhaps can confirm or tell me that I'm wrong. There is literature on the question of trust in political science. There is this idea of North and Southern Italy. What's the difference between the two places? Northern Italy creates trust across classes that allows us to create a public sphere. Southern Italy only has the segmented trust, the baklava model of society, where each piece is its own thing, and that's the piece is as a family, but it doesn't extend beyond the cut of each baklava piece. Can we talk a bit more about that, about this idea of local level filtering up at higher levels? Because to me, this is where you start creating the connections with the historians and you start understanding what is happening on the ground.
Yeah, there's a lot of literature in anthropology as well, both sociocultural anthropology, but also, for example, the archaeology of the Americas. They, keep talking about ways in which trust is built within members of a society, how we come to the idea of collectiveness and sense of belonging through trust. But also for archaeologists, this is a different way of thinking even about big monuments that usually we associate with elites and political propaganda. And that takes me back to the idea of reception that we were talking before with Tiffany. Instead, thinking of these monuments as a way both of reflecting the trust between ruled and rulers, but also as an activity, an embodied activity that allows that trust to be built. So this is, this is where I'm coming from with trust, but these two ideas together, trust and social capital, because I can trust many people, but there might be some people that, because they have more wide and extended networks, they can have more influence. And usually that influence, for me, I can easily imagine, and there's a lot of ethnographic work that allows me to imagine this, that, building or cleaning a well for your neighborhood does enhance your social capital, that you might never want to activate it, or you might want to activate it if you run out of coffee, for example. So you go to your neighbor, but you might also at some point want to activate it for something bigger. And this is something that I think we only think about political action from the end result, not the possibility that some actions could work in such a way that if there is an opportunity, they can manifest into political action. So that possibility. So coming back to the idea of trust, this is something I saw in your paper as well, when you talked about your soldiers, that they needed to be to feel that trust, and that trust had to be earned in order for them to be willing to sacrifice their lives to go and fight. And I think, that gives us a good analogy with politics. That trust has to be earned in order, it's not okay or a given to just take Byzantine Empire as a given. Why are these people trusting somebody who lives so far away from them and they've never seen him? That's why I made the argument that for Byzantine Athens, only 2 emperors had ever set foot. So, the average Byzantine Athenians experience is they've never seen this emperor. Of course, there are other tools, there are other ways, coins, liturgy. These are all ways to connect the civic populace with the empire. But that issue of trust, I think we have taken it for granted for a very long time, and we have to go back and see how that trust is built. You're muted.
Sorry, I see Alex's hand and then Yovanov's hand. Alex.
Yeah, so Fatini, thank you so much for this. I was really excited. Actually, I really got excited while listening to your paper. And again, I come from a perspective of somebody, who did the classics, I text alone, and then I moved to history, and I discovered post-processionalist archaeology for kind of Western medieval stuff while I was writing my dissertation, which focused on provincial cities for a while. So this was like really, really refreshing. So thank you. And now the question part. Do you ever get an idea of who gets to build where within the urban space? In a sense, because we have, or at least this is what I partially saw in the written sources. So again, this is, I think they can be quite complementary in this sense. For example, Georgios Akropolitis has a whole section on the city of Melnikon and Thessaloniki, where you see kind of Andronikos Palaiologos and then the future emperor Michael Palaiologos trying to kind of win over the public consensus in some way by renewing things, and then as some of the sources say, writing their names on things and things like that, versus local merchants, for example, who like to build up things and then try to compete against one another. And then again, according to the written sources, they actually get into conflicts fairly often over influence in the area, who gets to benefit more from the support of the populace. So do we see this in kind of the material culture on spacing who gets to build where, who's allowed to build where, and then some sorts of maybe, who destroys what or not? So yeah, that would be the question, kind of how does this realize in space?
Okay, so thank you. So, Alexander just kind of revealed to you my summer bits reading because I realize more and more there is a lot in the historical accounts as well, but I also want to see a little bit from court cases. I've read a lot on legislation and regulation about city building and things like that, but I am missing the other approach. From the material culture point of view, I will say, if you saw from the chaos in the walls, you understand that we start with a very complex situation that, it takes a huge amount of time, and, it's a character building activity, as I like to say to my students, to understand which wall goes with what everything else. So, to understand what is contemporary with what. However, a couple of things here. One of the things that we don't talk a lot in Byzantium, and I'm not sure that it's the right term to say middle class, but there is a category of people who are not poor, who are not elite, who might be merchants, who might not be merchants, that have buying ability. And I see that in the things that we find in the houses. These people are not wealthy, but they do have a couple of semi-luxury objects that speaks to what they can afford. So, these groups are very prominent in Byzantine Athens. Now, the other problem with the material culture, and I'm talking specifically for Athens, is that some of these houses, I think they're much bigger entities. So they're bigger complexes, if you like. And the question then is, how many people live there? How many families live there? We have spaces that are rented, spaces that are owned. Some of them, especially in the north part of the city, of the Agora, seem to have been manufacturing different goods. We see it in the material culture, so we see different tools or parts of a kiln, but it resonates very well with some of the graffiti we found in the Temple of Hephaestus that talks about this kind of industries. So we do also have a concentration there of some kind of activities that give us a little bit more insight of who is living there. The other thing is that these buildings are not static. These are living organisms, which means that windows are demolished, doors are sacked, new rooms are included, walls are thrown down. So, these are living organisms that architecturally keep moving even within 100 years. So just following that life cycle and biography of its structure is so much fun. But one of the things that keeps happening to me, and now that I've talked to other colleagues who work on different cities, is that we do see something changing dramatically in the cities. Somewhere in the beginning, first half of the 11th century. It feels to us like whatever was happening before in the city is like someone bought the city, demolished everything before, and rebuilt it, redesigned it, realigned it into something different. So, in the next decade, this is going to be a task for all the archaeologists to meet together, have this conversation, and also invite our historian friends to think about what is really changing, whether it's landed aristocracy, what are the things that are changing that allow such a dramatic change in the city. So, stay in touch. I'll let you know how.
Definitely, especially your chronology of 11th century changes kind of corresponds well with what we're trying to do, I guess, as historians. So with cities and urban history of Byzantium. Yeah. So yeah, thank you so much for all of this. This is really, really fruitful. And again, really fun to listen to the paper. So thanks.
I was so jet lagged, so I'm happy that you could understand what I was saying.
Oh yeah, no, it was spot on. Thanks.
Jovana?
Thank you very much. I'm going to join Alex's praises for just a little bit by saying that as a historian, seeing such good archaeological work and so well narrated, it's really kind of awe-inspiring for us. And I think my question is, because I'm currently working on questions of education and contemporary history, I immediately started thinking about how this is communicated to people, to current inhabitants of Athens or tourists, because I was going through a couple of those ads, touristic ads, and offers for the summer of 2000, well, the previously envisioned summer of 2020. So my question would be, how would you, I've seen that generally, and I've experienced throughout my life, that generally the focus is on statues, on people, on castles, on big structures that would communicate obvious power and obvious politics, so to say. And the politics as I understand it, and especially from this talk, is the streets. And if you wanted to make the streets the subject, if you wanted to communicate this and make it a public history problem and a project, how would you do this?
So yeah, thanks, Giovanna. Yes, you're right. If you took that away from my talk, the street is where you need to be. That's great. Like my job is done for the year. So let me start by saying that we, and when I say we with my students, we're doing a lot of digital humanities projects when it comes to Byzantine Athens. So that's why I was showing you a little bit of a caption for our VR project, but our students have created a virtual reality walk in Byzantine Athens. So you can walk and see little information, so far only for the cities, for the churches and the streets. So, that was an experiment for us to build on to create a more public facing project. So we've done 3D modeling for a couple of the buildings. We have done a virtual reality walk, but these were all experiments of how we would like to do that. The virtual reality part, I do like, but I would like to think of something that allows a visitor who is actually in the Athenian Agora being able to experience. And I think augmented reality is better in that way, because you can still see in front of you a 3D model, but you don't lose your physical surrounding landscape. When you are in the VR, forget it. You are in Byzantine Athens, or at least my version of Byzantine Athens, and you're just walking in. All of this, again, I will say, and for those of you who have some experience with these platforms, these are things that take a lot of time, because none of the buildings that we are creating in a 3D model exist. If you go right now, I mean, all of the photos, the drawings I showed you in my talk, none of these buildings exist. They have all been destroyed in order for the archaeologists to go to the classical layers. So, you know, we're rebuilding, in order to rebuild this 3D model, we have to rebuild the actual archaeology of its house from the notebooks themselves. So, you know, that, that takes a long time. But in terms of schedule, my aim, my goal for the next decade, as I said before, now that my book on villages is done and I can fully, you know, keep my attention to Athens and not going back and forth, is to actually start heavily writing grants so we can create a digital humanities project in order for having a lesson plan so you can teach your students about Byzantine Athens if you want. Also have input from the public who would like to work with us and, you know, help us with the 3D modeling. So we want to create this kind of platform, provide training, and, you know, hopefully people can be able to use that material when they're actually on site. Because let me tell you, someone who works in the Agora for the last 7 years, this is a very complicated archaeological site. And, you know, it's hot and people are coming, and you know, there's such a mix of buildings from different periods. And, you know, I sit there in the Sardanapalus thinking, what is it that they understand? I mean, it's so complex. So, you know, contributing to that and, you know, give them something from the Byzantine layers is something that, you know, it's our goal for the new decade. Dimitri, again, you're mute.
And it's ultimately an eminently political question. Because how you present the Agora was a choice. Yes. That was made with very specific ideas of what being Greek per se means, and finding a way to place the Byzantine layers back into the narrative has very clear implications about how you conceive Greek identity. And yes, Byzantium has, in general, been reclaimed, and there has been a process of reclaiming it since the 19th century. But in terms of conception of the space itself, it's not there. I mean,
and it's a very specific vision of Byzantium. I mean, you know, if you see, because Yovanovich was talking about tourism, there's a lot of emphasis on religious tourism, and a lot of Byzantine monuments come to display. So, you know, the image we project is Byzantium equals Christianity equals religion. And if that had been the case, I would have never become a Byzantinist. I will say that much. But, you know, but there are no people. No one is walking in a Byzantine street. No one is doing something. Byzantine cooking, you know, things like that. So, you know, it's not just about adding the Byzantine layers, but creating a very different narrative about the Byzantine world that can be more inclusive and more connected to modern needs and modern anxieties. And at least for me, you know, this is where I'm going with this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So we'll pivot and pass the baton to Alex Yovanovich, who will discuss Ioannis III Vatagis' Italian venture, Byzantine Imperial Revival in Mediterranean Diplomacy Unit. Yeah.
Thank you for the intro. And yeah, as I already thanked every single speaker so far, but really thank you for this. This is turning out to be way more fun than I've expected. And I use this word very, very intentionally because this is one thing that I've kind of noticed being in the field now. I don't want to age myself or make myself important anyway, but you know, I've been reading stuff at least for a decade now. And Byzantine studies tend not to do things in a fun way. So when I said that, when I complimented Fotini for saying the paper was really fun, that is, I think, the utmost compliment I can give to anybody in the field, because we are very afraid of doing things in a way that's actually engaging outside the immediate kind of audience we get. And that is something that kind of is in the background of the paper that I presented. The idea for something like this paper, without having read the sources or anything, came to my mind as I was preparing for my comprehensive exams back in 2015, 2016. And one of my fields was in late Ottoman studies. So kind of the Ottoman Empire of the 19th, 20th century, that, you know, in high school, elementary school, especially if you're from around the Balkans, you learn as kind of, you know, the Ottoman Empire equals the sick man of Europe. And then I read this kind of fascinating body of scholarship, for which I do thank Dr. Thomas Kuhn, who's not around, but for the extensive list. But the attempt that the Ottomanists have put in reviving and kind of reconceptualizing the way in which we perceive the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century was quite fascinating, because they have the whole kind of push to start seeing the Ottoman Empire as an independent agent with its own kind of imperialist endeavors and you know, protectionist endeavors and whatever endeavors vis-a-vis not just Europe but the rest of the world. So it's not simply there as to be one of the objects or pawns that's moved by be it the Habsburg monarchy or being later on Britain and France. This is how I actually got into later Byzantium, which is again usually presented as this kind of body that's shrinking and it's devoid of any agency, and you know, a sick man on Bosphorus would be actually even a compliment to what Byzantinists are doing to late Byzantium, or have done in the past. I think things are changing for way better now with more recent scholarship. But anyhow, so the idea about this paper basically came with the whole question of, okay, what happens after 1204? With the whole idea of the something that Christian Raffensperger called the Byzantine Ideal, right? So everybody's allegedly copying Byzantium or some sort of Roman models and all that around the West, and then it all of a sudden ceases. And that kind of seemed a bit of a rough cut. And then actually I was looking for sources to translate for my students at the University of Fraser Valley where I teach. And I ran into a kind of series of documents from the Cypriot Chancery in the 13th century, where you have exchange documents or exchange oaths in writing between the Seljuk Sultan and the crusading king of Cyprus. So none of them speaks Greek, and they exchange oaths officially in Greek. So this was my idea. Okay, why do they do this in Greek and not in Persian and Latin, or, you know, Turkish and French or something? And from there, I started going through any sort of kind of Greek-produced letters in the Mediterranean in the 13th century and onwards. And to my surprise, they constitute not the majority, but at least, you know, a good percentage of letters produced outside Byzantium in the 13th century and onwards. So this was quite of a fascinating discovery. And then eventually I ran into Federico II's letters. And then again, Federico II is kind of well-known entity outside Byzantine studies as well. So I tried to basically attach Ioannis to him in a way to basically show this, yeah, let's talk about the Byzantine Empire as, you know, an independent political agent, and not simply, again, some sort of a rump state, as it was called in scholarship, that, you know, kind of exists around there and is basically waiting for its imminent fall in 1453. So so in this way, this kind of paper was then brought just as one of the potential examples of how we see Byzantine agency in the so-called time of decline, or post-1204, developing quite vividly after 1204. So yeah, that would be then kind of the background of the paper. And again, the whole point of the paper is to show the active political agency of the Byzantine Empire post-1204 on a single example of 2 letters. So it's nothing much, but I think for presentation purposes, it's kind of more effective to stay kind of focused on less than go more and then kind of get lost in the narrative. So yeah, that would be what I have to say about the paper, or how I came with the idea. I came up with the idea.
So Alex, thank you. And to get the ball rolling, I'll basically, I think it's a difficult question, but we might as well start addressing it. we've had discussions repeatedly, and I think the last one was on a grassy knoll 3 days ago, socially distanced drinks under the sun, where we, in discussing the material that you work with, we realized that there is significant bodies of Greek speakers outside the boundaries of whatever organized Roman state might survive post-1204. And those are not just people where you would expect them to be in Anatolia, but it is indeed southern Italy. And you seem to be, since you wrote this paper, you've been discovering more and more and more documents from southern Italy. What I wonder is, what was the impact of the existence of these populations outside political boundaries imposed by reality and force to the different Roman polities post-1204 on the decision-making and on the ideology of projected out of these Roman centers? I mean, you've mostly worked with the Lascarids, because if we were to go into our modern era, we think of irredentism as a main kind of driver of state policy in let's say, the Greek state. Vertilis's work emphasizes again and again and again how the Greek state, which is born bankrupt, continues being fiscally a mess because the irredentist aspiration is more important than the idea that than organized economics. So these kinds of concerns, can we trace them in the thought of the officials or even emperors, if we can chart that thought, or are they a bit more lackadaisical about it? Yeah, there is these Romans there. We'll get to them when we can. What do you see?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a twofold question and answer, I guess. So depends on how you focus and what you focus on. I think, and this is something I'm becoming one of those people. This is something I've done in my dissertation. The example of Anatolia is a much easier one, right? Because we have more kind of Greek language production from there. And in the 13th century, I actually, because I followed Michael before he becomes an emperor, Palaiologos, he spends a couple of years there. And the idea I got from reading both Seljuk sources, for example, in the Seljuk sources, we've learned about, a 5-year uprising in 13th century Italia that was aided by the Kingdom of Cyprus of the Romans, as they put it in the sources. Well, none of the Byzantine sources ever writes about this rebellion, right? So you see a whole set of a kind of Roman political agency in the Seljuk state, way into the 13th century, right? And then from this to other examples in the Seljuk state, at least, we basically see that the state, or the way that the Seljuk monarchy is built partially on accommodating or keeping the Greek-speaking population at peace or pacified, right? So that's one thing. The other one then is from the aforementioned rebellion from whatever it was, like 1205 to 1211 or something. In Italia, for example, Acropolitis never mentions it, Pachymedes neither, none of the written sources ever mentioned this. And then you get to think about, well, they're the official kind of historians of the Roman state, right? Acropolitis being a state official throughout his life, basically. You get to think, is he writing the history of the Romans or a history of the Roman state? And you get to conclude that he's writing the history of the Roman state within a specific kind of concept of his own of what the Roman state at the time is. Even though you have the Roman diaspora that is certainly significant. And then this was my conclusion a couple of years ago as I was writing that specific chapter. But now that I came to the Italian example, I actually confirmed this even further. So again, the manuscript production alone of texts in Greek, in southern Italy, in Calabria, as well as in Naples is actually fascinating. Be it just the copying of texts, or be it translations of, Aristotle from Greek to Italian right away in Latin, no Arab kind of connection with Spain and all that, right? Gives an idea of kind of the Byzantine ideal being well and alive when it comes to, you know, things that matter. So this is the thing that the Byzantine court is studying. Why don't we do this in the Regno as well, right? With a clear idea, of course, of you having the king being also the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. But yes, the question is then again, what's the role of the, you know, back to Foutini's paper, kind of the grassroots of this kind of Greek-speaking presence, both in Anatolia and southern Italy, and how much they influence the local rulers, emperors, kings, sultans, whomever, in their policy making, vis-a-vis then the Byzantine emperor, who might see these people as kind of, you know, potentially Roman. So is this a thing you should kind of reconquer in a way in some point? But then we don't see that in rhetoric fairly often, right? In later Byzantine rhetoric, even for Vatatzis, who was like a big emperor reconquering stuff and all that, or for Michael VIII, who actually started sponsoring rhetoricians again massively, reconquering Italy never comes as a full-on thing, right? This is where the Romans live, we should conquer it. So I would go back to kind of the idea of the state, or at least the imperial presence of the state. They're more careful about how they project the image of themselves, especially when it comes to Italy, which might be well out of their grasp when it comes to political realities. Similar to Anatolia, right? Anatolia remains active in Byzantine rhetoric as a potential space of reconquest until the later part of Manuel I's rule, right? And then after Mediocephalon, this idea slowly dies out, and post-1204, reconquering whole of Anatolia is not really ever mentioned even in rhetoric, let alone realized in practice. So I would say that specifically for political agency, having too big aspirations in rhetoric might actually backfire eventually, right? So you should be careful how you frame your successes and then your intended successes, precisely because you need to keep the populace kind of, you know, supporting you in some way, at least the ones who are going to hear the speech, and the speeches are going to be heard by mostly the elites at the court at the time, right? So I hope this partially answers the question. So it depends on how you see it, right? Again, on the one hand, you have the rulers in Anatolia, Italy, who depend on the Greek-speaking populace, and they have to take them into account on how they run their state. On the other hand, you have the Roman state that necessarily is not even trying to get officially actively engaged with the Roman diaspora, even though we can only imagine about all of the connections that exist between them. And I think I mentioned this 3 days ago, and I'll finish with this. When there are migrations from around Gallipoli to southern Italy post-1204, with family members moving to their family members in Italy, right? So clearly family ties exist between the Mediterranean, basically, regardless of within which borders do you belong, right? And they come from the same cultural background and view and stuff like that. You're muted.
Which raises the broader question of how does ethnicity get activated politically in the Middle Ages, and what it is that activates it. Yes, Yovana.
Just a quick follow-up on this. If I remember it well, if I've written down well, I think it was framed, and Michael, the eighth autobiography was framed as bringing freedom to the Sicilians. It was not like reconquest; it was rather freeing them. So I was wondering, how did this? Is this a term that is that brings some kind of a different value to at least a rhetorical table, if not a practical one? Is it important, or is it something that appears a lot as a way to frame your aspirations, foreign affairs?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for it. Yeah, actually, right. Michael said something. If I would have the liberty to say that I was the God's vehicle in delivering freedom to the people of Sicily, I think that's how he frames it. Yeah, I mean, the whole autobiographical piece by Michael is, I think, is one of my kind of favorite written sources of the shorter kind. But yes, and again, I think this is the point of that we can start expanding on how does the emperor within Byzantium define his own role in the state and freedom vis-a-vis it, right? And then how he sees it as his mission to even, transgress his own borders in bringing the freedom to people who are oppressed. In this case, it was Sicily, convenient enough for Michael. Yeah, I think this is definitely part of a greater pose, right? That the emperor would have, especially an emperor with not to say problematic rule, but Michael VIII's rule was not an easy one from the beginning onwards, right? So he had a lot of demons to deal with throughout his reign. So And conveniently enough, he wrote this. I mean, that he knew that he was going to die. He did not, but he wrote this in the last year of his life. So the Sicilian Vespers ended up being basically his, last accomplishment, even if you will, not just for the autobiography, but really for his life. So the whole kind of freedom moment at the end, and mind you, it's framed at the very end of the autobiography. So it's kind of there, I think, as kind of a punchline. And then he ends, thanks God for, being the vehicle to delivering freedom and prosperity, not just to the Romans, but people elsewhere. And then he's done. And that's the typicon of his monastery, right? The opening for a typicon. So definitely an intentional pose, if you ask me, right? And then again, he would not use the word, eleftheria or whatever, just like that. So it's a big word to be used, especially by an emperor.
Yeah,
Fotini?
Yeah, thanks for this. I mean, I have to say, I should start by saying that considering how little work has been done in Vatadzis, I am just amazed that I still have to meet a Byzantine historian who this is not their favorite emperor. I mean, there's such a consent that he's so good. So, even before you started, even before I started listening to your talk, I thought, Vatadzis is in here. So the letters, the fact that they're written in Greek was shocking, very surprising to me. This was not what I would have anticipated. And, that kind of made me start thinking, not against your arguments, but with you in your presentation about how this conversation between the two rulers could really not be a dialogue, but a monologue for each of them. So what is hidden in their response that actually serves their own interests? So, I kept wondering, why is Vatadzis using Greek? And is it a way to project an idea of a Byzantium that goes beyond political borders and forcing or wanting to test if Federico has the resources to answer in Greek? So, that kind of competition, which is, goes back to Hittites and Egyptians and letters calling each other brothers, right?
Yes.
So, the Greek, I think, sets the tone for that kind of relationship that, of course, it's friendly from what you're presenting, but it's also clear to me that there is also a guarded competition and also used by both sides for talking about their own authority. And you mentioned in the very beginning that there is a marriage that seals the deal. And I think this is so crucial because that gives, I think, more incentive to Federico to treat Vatadzis as his equal. If he does not, that means that, giving his daughter away in someone who is inferior was not a good choice. So, again, he's using that language of his equal to talk about himself. That look at what the political alliance I was successful in doing with this other great guy. So, for me, these letters are just talking about themselves rather than really, his choice of calling the Byzantine Ceremonies and not Graeci, as you pointed out. This is really about his agenda against the Pope. That, yes. You say so well. And then, I was surprised that he sent troops to Italy. This is where you got me at the end. And, I kept thinking that if that was me, I would not have sent it. Like, I would be too worried about my troops to send them there. And this is, my question for you, because for me, I was trying to think, is he sending them because he's trapped in this conversation of we're equal. So when my friend and my relative asked me for help, I have to now, since I said how wonderfully I'm doing, to send it? Or am I doing this because the Angeli is across the sea and I'm using this as an indirect message to someone else? Because, I wouldn't send the troops. So I really wanted a little bit for you to tell me what you thought about that.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, thanks for this. And I definitely agree that it is a monologue. But I think this is something that kind of rehashes my point. Because if you're doing the monologue in Greek on top of that, as the ruler of the Italian Regno, you're actually giving that prestige to Ioannis that usually modern scholars tend to take away. Or not to Ioannis specifically as a monarch, like through the Byzantine Empire, right? Because first of all, it's the competition whether you can do Greek. So it's still the language of prestige and not a long forgotten thing that it's not ever used in, you know, past the whatever, the Sea of Adriatic or something like that, far from it. So it's definitely a self-laudatory thing that you do, and its official kind of correspondence between two emperors, they have to be self-laudatory. That's the point. And the fact that only Federico's letters survive in the Italian chancellery, right? Not the Greek, not Vatatzis's ones, is exactly that. It's the proof of, again, Jovanov's point of letter collections and why certain sort of survive, certain do not. That's definitely the point. On top of that, just to kind of, again, rehash the importance of Greek in Italy. For example, Federico's usually, in Western medieval scholarship, he's usually regarded as the one who promoted the most liberal or progressive laws in the 13th century in his Liber Augustalis. That, mind you, was written parallelly in Greek and in Latin. So there's a full surviving Greek version of it, right? So Greek language certainly does have a big kind of, you know, value culturally, diplomatically, in any way that you will. And then again, the Cypriot chancellery is Greek only, even to corresponding with the Seljuks and other kind of Muslim states. And they have the responses in Greek as well. So it's definitely kind of this posh lingua franca of the region well into the 13th century. As for the sending the troops part, I like that part. Again, it's a very kind of, it's a sentence, but in a couple of sources. And in one of the earlier letters from Federico to Ioannis, we see that Federico sent some troops to Ioannis to help him fight the Crusaders. So partially Ioannis had kind of this idea that, you know, tit for tat, you should repay that. Also, I think it was definitely sending a strong message to the Angeli at the time, because this was earlier in Ioannis's reign. The one military expedition that we know of that really did happen. For the 1251, we can only speculate. But for the earlier one that did happen, it was definitely that, because that was about the time when Ioannis was, I think, contending for Thessaloniki, getting into the city, and then had this kind of volatile cohabitation with the Angeli. On top of that, I think this is a clear message to Federico himself, actually, right? We still have things to kind of do. We're not weakened. And eventually to the papacy, who at that time is already sending diplomatic embassies trying to negotiate some sort of a church union. That, and again, back to the monologue and competition between them, it clearly is this, because Vatatzis kept accepting all of the embassies from papacy to negotiate a church union while he was being close to Federico, which led Federico to sending him things and back and forth. But this all to say, then we clearly see this empire as a very, very clear active agent in the Mediterranean that was actually quite dominating the politics even, right? And was able to send soft power and strong power messages throughout the Mediterranean quite easily. And he continued to do so at least until the end of Michael Palaiologos' reign. So I hope this kind of answers that.
Yeah, no, it does. And, you know, I mean, I hadn't realized, but I realize it more now that, you know, you were explaining this, that, you know, that gives a very good base, a good starting point for thinking about late Byzantine politics and how we arrive in a state that's very flexible to reimagine itself every time something changes in the political network of the Mediterranean. So they can play enemies and allies together and always rely on that prestige of a Byzantine ecumeny with its limitations. But, you know, that flexibility that, you know, at least I, as someone who does late Byzantium, I see so remarkable for this period. You know, hearing you now, I'm realizing that it's actually starting in that time of the Lascarid. So yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Alex, thank you. And now we're going to exercise maximum flexibility as we try to incorporate to the ancient world, the Romantics, and go to Alex Ramatikos and his paper, Donning Effeminacy to Challenge Imperial Rule, the Gendered Politics of Lord Byron's Sardanapalus. Before, sorry. I want to point out that we have been more gregarious than anticipated, which is to say that it's been a good discussion. We don't have a limit for how long we have the Zoom webinar for us, but I'll try and contain myself at the very end and perhaps even sacrifice for the sanity of the participants and attendees. But since we do have the forum, we could even leave it in an informal fashion after 11:15 or something, so that people who need to go, understandably, can go. So Alex, to you.
Yeah, so I'm not a Byzantinist, the only one on the panel, and I'm a romanticist doing Assyrian history. So when I was invited, I decided to just have some fun, as Byron did, I'm sure, writing Sardanapalus or Sardanapalus, however you like to pronounce it. I want to have some fun. I've always been quite attracted to Sardanapalus, who is this kind of he's mythical for starters, but he's the supposed last ruler of the Assyrian Empire and the end of the 609 BC. So yeah, it's the end of the Assyrian Empire, and according to Theodore Sisylus's Biographica Historica, the reason that the empire falls is because Sardanapalus is too self-indulgent, he wants to party too much, and he's effeminate. So what's being posited here is that an effeminate leader cannot rule an empire well enough. What is required to rule an empire is kind of this bravado, this masculinist display. And I think in light of recent events, quite frankly, I'm sick of these kinds of the macho men that we're seeing in North America and Europe and other places. I think I'm just sick of this kind of masculinist display that we don't really ever question. This kind of state and imperial power, and it's men who are displaying it. We've got the biggest empire, the best empire, all the best adjectives that some rulers around the world have, and then they're hiding in bunkers, right? So what I'm seeing here is this kind of this display of bravado, this performance of state that we don't really question. So what I found interesting about Sardanapalus as a character is we quite immediately, and Byron makes it quite apparent, that we're dealing with this effeminate ruler, and he plays up the performance of his effeminacy, and he links his effeminacy to he's a pacifist. Like he has this line, "I can't go on multiplying empires," right? And so while I'm interested in, the fact that we see, once Sardanapalus on stage, you can't take your eyes off of him while on the page, at least. Why don't we question these kinds of more masculinist performances of state? And so in my presentation, I kind of showed Putin riding a bear, which is of course photoshopped. And then, in November 2019, Trump, put out a tweet of himself, his head on Rambo's body, and I found that very entertaining in terms of sometimes you think, this is clear. Some people are like, well, this is clearly ridiculous for Trump to have such a big ego, to think of himself as this masculine Rambo, Vietnam War vet, which itself is ironic that he's a war vet. But if you do go into the comments and you do look at the supporters of someone like Trump, it becomes scary how they actually feed in. Yes, that's our leader. He's the man, and then the kind of misogyny that follows all that. So that's kind of what I was interested in. I was interested in performance and imperial or state power, which I kind of played with those terms a little bit too much, and the fact that an effeminate leader was seen as in terms of imperial power, effeminacy and empire can't go well together. And so I think just like Byron himself was fed up with British politics of the 1820s. He publishes his play in 1821, King George IV, and his political inefficacies. Maybe I'm a little bit fed up with the strong men of the world and their performances. Their performances, though, that clearly have real life consequences. So I'll stop there. I'll stop there. And maybe just go to questions from now.
So to kick it off, there is within your presentation, I was going to ask
You're
about
muted.
the context, and again? Oh.
I hear you. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay, sorry, you confused me. For once, I got it right. Oh, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Oh, it seems that Alex has a bit of an issue. Anyhow, you started putting a bit of the context of where he's writing, when he's writing, and what this is trying to address. Because to me, that is a question. What is the exact situation in England that calls for this kind of a critique? I mean, this is the one level question. The second level, of course, is that you point out very clearly in your paper that while Sardanapalus is kind of projected as this anti-imperialist character, he is not anti-imperial. And by imperial, I mean he enjoys the endless resources that allow for the endless partying, and those resources are the product of structures of subjugation of his own people and so on and so forth. The question ultimately is this for Byron a way to construct a jovial story that will be performed and a bunch of his erudite friends, when they say it, will have fun and get drunk? Or can we start teasing out more and more detailed political messages that fit to the times when England is on the beginning of a very long period of imperial expansion, but also fit to the questions of the times when actual rulers of England need to be perhaps critiqued for specific vices? I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I don't think I have a perfect answer, but just to talk about briefly, Byron himself, self-exile from England in 1816. There's speculation on why that exile took place, but basically probably questions around his bisexuality and his affair with his half-sister. If you know Byron, he was controversial. But all to say, I mean, he hated George III and he hated his son, George IV, who preceded him in 1821. And, there's been critical discussion. I'm thinking of Marilyn Butler, for example, about Nineveh as kind of a flip side of contemporary Britain of the 1820s. This kind of, and in my presentation, I talked about the Brighton Pavilion, and George IV was known for, hosting these lavish parties at his, at his orientalized palace that he had built in Brighton. And so when approaching Sardanapalus, and I think the first time I read the play, I was taken by his pacifism, and he's, I don't want to go on multiplying empires. What's wrong with partying is basically, what's wrong with a little party? I don't want to hurt anybody, right? And so I think the first time I read, I fell into this Sardanapalus kind of ideology until reading over and over and being perhaps a little bit more critical, and also understanding the historical background that ultimately Sardanapalus' philosophy doesn't work, and it's for the reasons you point out, that though he might be anti-imperial in the sense of he doesn't want to go on extending the empire, his hedonistic, his palatial lifestyle is built upon the subjugation of his subjects, right? And so I think that this is the conundrum at the middle of in the middle of the play, that Byron seems to endorse Sardanapalus, but seems to also not endorse him. So it's a little bit of both. Ultimately, I think the question of gender is important in terms of Sardanapalus is trying to do something interesting with gender, with masculinity, femininity, and effeminacy. And I think he's trying to restructure the gender norms of his empire, but of course, that's never really a historical possibility for him. So Byron's asking interesting questions, but ultimately, I don't think Byron has a solution. He has, at the very end, he has Sardanapalus and his Greek lover, Mira, start up this funeral pyre, and they jump into it together, kind of effacing gender and class distinctions, etc. But like, as I mentioned in my paper, those who are coming to take over are going to be taking over very soon. So the political effect is very, for me, very minimal.
So I'm going to try and patch in one of our attendees and panelists for tomorrow, Panayotis. I'll press the button. Let's see. Okay.
Hi, hello.
Okay. Hello.
Can you hear me? Hello.
Yes.
Yes.
First of all, thank you. I want to ask Alex if he thinks maybe there's a positive side to masculinity, because in his talk, I think it was a bit unfairly equated with things. Masculinity was equated with things like violence, authoritarianism, egoism. Maybe he mentioned Trump. So, is there a positive side, or does masculinity have to be compensated in some sense by becoming more feminine? So masculinity is the one pole, and the other pole is femininity, which is the good. I want him to explain his thought.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I would call masculinity the bad or femininity the good, and I think part of Byron's point is that infusing an empire with kind of femininity is no real solution at all. It doesn't. I mean, that's not really going to do anything. In terms of the way that I talked about masculinity, and I'm talking about Byron's Sardanapalus specifically, it's when it's linked with imperial or state power, what the kind of performance of gender does, and what it really actualizes, right? So I'm interested between that kind of line between the performance and the actualization, the effect of the performance. So in terms of what I'm talking about specifically, what would Byron have equated masculinity with violence? Yes. With tyranny, perhaps yes. But I mean, ultimately, I don't. It's a hard answer. I don't think masculinity is necessarily the bad and femininity is the good. I think that would be obviously, as I'm sure you'd agree, Panayoti, I think that'd be a bit of a simplistic equation, right? So I hopefully that's not the only thing that the thing that my presentation brought out. I'm just talking about in terms of the play specifically, the way that masculinity was portrayed.
Could I turn to audience or attendees for a possible other question? Yes, Tiffany.
Hi, Alex. Thank you so much for your paper. It was also just so fun, and I loved our basis of starting with Eurovision and going from there. And yeah, I did very much resonate with this paper in terms of course, my own fascination with these like pageantry and ceremonial ideas. And I know, of course, you are not a Byzantinist, but I do, again, coming from a place of science and now being in history, very obvious questions very much surprise me. So like, my question for you is, can we think of Byzantine ceremonies as gendered performances? I'm like, how could we do this? Like,
yeah, about an hour and a half ago when we were on your discussion, that's kind of the question I was trying to get to, but I think I lost track. I thought that when you kind of, when you were speculating in this kind of very intelligent way, I thought, Byron would love this. She's going back to her history books like he would, and kind of piecing toward, I could see this, your discussion of Michael V as a kind of play, and then, a tragedy where he's blinded at the end, right, and exiled, right? So I don't know enough about the Byzantine or the Byzantine Empire. I'll just call it that for now. But yeah, I mean, I guess I'm going to throw back the question to you in a way. Like, do you see, like, is there any way that you could see gender in kind of in those kinds of, you know, performances of, you know, the Book of Ceremonies, for example?
Yeah, I will.
We can discuss this later.
Exactly.
I'm just kind of throwing it back to you in a way.
Yeah. No, and this is it's an interesting question. It's something that I don't know if like we as Byzantinists have gotten to this. I don't know.
Yeah.
We're still trying to sort out where the emperor turned when he woke up and had to step out of his bed. That's the Book of Ceremonies is still this text that to some degree is technical. Okay, I'm being a bit unfair now to Dagron and people who have thought intelligently about that. So I am a bit mindful of time.
Thank you.
And in that sense, I feel I'm doing you a bit of an injustice, Alexei, by
You're not doing me injustice. Yeah.
I'm going to try and use the discussion, the final point of discussion, basically my paper on army commanders as managers of demotic power in Byzantium, with a sub-focus on debate, persuasion, and the politics among the Genostatiotikon as a way to perhaps bring everything together. I think that the themes of performance, space, dialogue, public opinion, debate, discussion come up in all of the papers, and in doing so, they fundamentally weave a canvas of intense political action. And if I would wish this panel to relate something is a state of play for Byzantine studies, but also for our distant affiliates in the Romantic era, where we're seriously trying to explore and do justice to the ways in which people who have been conceived for very political reasons as members of a totalitarian kind of theocracy were able to participate in politics in meaningful ways. It's not an easy process, and it requires reading against the grain of our sources, whether those are textual or, for that matter, material. What I try to do in my paper is in a way that to go past the sort of historiographical climax of a victory that is celebrated because that's what historians do, and step back and look at the less discussed moment of debate and deliberation and try and see what this tells us about the Byzantine army, specifically in a way, because the Byzantine army is, as even non-Byzantinists would know, quite active in participating in politics. Now, usually we don't call this politics because we call it rebellion. But in a Clausewitzian kind of way, this is just an extension of politics. So what does it mean that thousands of people move following a campaign, their leader, to achieve a goal which is ultimately political? And even fighting a foreign enemy is a political goal. So if I did anything in my paper which had to be seriously truncated, remove any theoretical context, hoping that this can be provided in our discussion, was to basically show point after point after point after point in various kinds of sources, historical texts, texts written about how you manage war, strategica, tactica, and so on and so forth, and occasionally rhetorical texts, this notion that the Roman army, because we're talking about a Roman army, is a space of deliberation. And when I was asking Tiffany earlier on, hey, or no, Giovanna, sorry, what do you do with the problem of time and the vast spans of time that we're dealing with? I was asking that because ultimately it's an anxiety that all of us who try to present Byzantium as meaningfully Roman have to deal with. What does it mean that I cite Julius Caesar in a paper about 11th century campaigns, among other things. To conclude and leave it to you all for possible questions, one thing that my paper hopefully does is emphasize the degree to which a military commander cannot be seen simply as a burly man with the capacity to kill his enemies, pretty much like Dionys in the Epic of Dionys. Military man is fundamentally a political animal, pragmatikos anir in Polybian fashion, who our Byzantine sources tell us explicitly gets his training on talking, not necessarily by talking to the army per se, but by having a prior life before the army in a city. And of course, this brings us to other issues that Fotini also touched upon, these connections of the state with the provinces. And the army is one of the main interfaces that brings provinces and the state together. And with that, I'll conclude. And I see that there's two attendees who would like to engage. I'll pass it on to Miron. Okay. Is he unmuted? What? Give me a second. Okay.
Yes, I would like, I have a question for Mr. Krallis.
Yeah.
In your presentation, you shed some light on a misunderstood side of the Byzantine Empire. My question will be short, I promise. Does the spirit of pluralism and debate among the soldiers represent a general rule, a general state of the political Byzantine structure?
Well, this is basically one of our central questions. I would say that it represents a state of constant potentiality. Those of us who try to do the work that foregrounds the political nature of the Byzantine political community have not forgotten that there is an emperor who, even though frequently toppled, tends to at times rule, in the case of Basil II, for 50 years. Political action is something that is not explicit political action, because Fotini talked about very political actions on a daily basis, day to day, has to be seen as a potentiality, as something that happens on the micro level consistently, as negotiations take place consistently at the local level. Again, to go back to Fotini's paper, she mentioned that the provincial administrators have short terms, they cannot always interfere aggressively locally, but they are still in constant negotiation with the local authorities. And you will be surprised how many times they get killed by the locals. So I think there is everyone in the political community we have come to call Byzantium was aware that politics was just around the corner. It was a point of the moment you were disappointed by your political leaders, the moment those leaders did not serve your interests, the possibility of rebellion was just there. Now, there were different ways of articulating that in the provinces, where you worked through the army and through sending messengers to villages to convince them that they need to send you their money to support the army. And there were very different ways of doing that in Constantinople, whereas Tiffany said, yeah, you tried to convince the populace and you failed. You misread the situation. I hope this answers the question.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much.
Can we pass to Yorgos? Lauren, I assume you control that. Yorgos?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes, all right. So thank you very much for a very interesting session. From a philosophical point of view, it's very interesting to hear, to listen to papers and speeches regarding history, not regarding, somehow mixing history and politics. It's very interesting. I hope the same will go on tomorrow for you when you will be listening to philosophical and economical speeches. So my question is addressed to my friend Dimitris. And it's a question that it's not, I don't believe it goes to the core of your speech, but it's the one question that, you know, went through my mind as I was listening to it. It's both your speech and Fotini's speech drew a sketch of the Byzantine era as quite modern, with a good sense of the word modern, I mean. And this is something that I really believe it's the right way to address Byzantium. But I would like to ask, why do you think that the notion that the Byzantine era is somehow a historical parenthesis, something that it's not linked to the ancient Greek era or to the Roman Empire, as we are looking to the past, or that is not linked to the era of the scientific revolutions in the Enlightenment era after the 16th, 17th, 18th century? Why this notion is so well established that it sounds as radical and revolutionary to talk about a modern concept of Byzantium? That's my long question.
So your long question, of course, would require that we meet again on a third day and have a conference on the Constitution of Byzantine Studies, because fundamentally this is what you're ultimately outlining. Short answer to that, and this is why being in Molivos would have been ideal, because we would have had Uzo discussing this. The short answer would be that for very specific reasons, starting with Western, broadly conceived medieval concerns that convert the so-called Byzantines into Greki, and going all the way to the Enlightenment, which is the main driver for the constitution of our field. Byzantium becomes a punching bag, not because it's necessarily hated in the period of the Enlightenment for what it is, but for what it represents in discourses that have nothing to do with Byzantium per se. Byzantium becomes the Ancien Regime. You cannot openly talk about the French king, but you can talk about Byzantium. And that plays a pretty fundamental role. Also, the other thing, I tend to talk to my students about Romanness and Rome as a brand, telling them that it's probably one of the most successful brands, along with Hellenism too. It's like on the part of Coca-Cola and so on and so forth. But you know, copyright wars are fought around brands. And at the cultural level and at the ideological level, one of the most important copyright laws that has been fought in Europe has been on Romanness. French kings against German kings, eventually Americans on the Capitol inventing a different kind of Romanness that they have to use for their own political needs. And of course, this comes to be combined with a Greek problem. When out of Romni, Greeks have to be born, because this is a more expedient way to gain independence, because no Westerner will fight for someone who's deluded enough to think they're Roman. You have a problem with Byzantium, because you start creating Byzantium as a Hellenic thing alone. It is also Hellenic, but then you start throwing away the Romanness. So if the Greek side is not ready to defend that Romanness and see what it means, because it doesn't fit the national narrative, and if on the Western side, Byzantium starts from being a punching bag and an answer to different kinds of questions, and it's also geopolitical concerns, it gets too complicated, poor Byzantium doesn't really have a chance to survive. I've discussed this with a few of from my Vancouver crowd. I'm reading Weber for my own perverse needs, research needs right now. And again, poor Byzantium appears in Weber in footnotes. I'll discuss this eventually. Well, either he maybe we're unlucky and he died and he had a plan to discuss it, but again, it's a footnote. That's the shortest I can give to that answer without having a conference. And I don't know that it's necessarily completely satisfactory.
No, it is. It is. For the time being is very satisfactory. So we will continue in another place for that. Thank you.
Kosti, can I get you into the discussion? Oh, sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to really thank you for a very exciting set of papers and a wonderful discussion. I am a flaneur in the Byzantine field, or at least that is my small foray tomorrow. But I really enjoyed the discussion today. I have two rather, I think, more provocative questions of a general character, and they came up as I was listening to your talks and as I was listening to the discussion. I wonder if this discussion on continuity or rupture or break between the ancients and the Byzantine is a useful bipolar discussion. You know, you have to choose a flag and plant it either in the continuity or the change bit or the break bit. And you've all, discussed this in your papers in some ways, I think. And if we're moving outside this two bipolar continuity or change, or continuity or rather rupture, if I may say, rather than change, which is a more complex term, how can we discuss this term? And the second thing is I really enjoyed, partly because I'm working on similar themes, the idea of reader reception, which is, the unknown masses who we never listen to, but listen to us or listen to documents and all of these things. And there's this has been, I was just thinking that you might find interesting that there's a very broad field in English and other literature, especially in English literature from the early 2000s, effectively, about the paraphernalia of texts and the intertextuality that you're all alluding to, that stems from marginalia to what some text references are working towards others, what do formal and informal texts bring in their united sort of picture rather than by themselves, and therefore in that way try to refocus the attention from the proclamations or from the documentation, whether it's a novel, it could be a formal piece of writing, to the readers and their reactions, which are of course an unknown thing. And I thought, what are your reflections to the extent that you can on these different sources, on possible marginalia that you found, on texts that refer to official texts and official texts that allude to unofficial texts. So two very broad questions, more of an introspective nature than anything, but more an effort to thank you for your presentations today.
Would other people in the panel want to pick this up? Ideas, comments, guys? I can take a stab at this. Well, there's two questions. The continuity, non-continuity. In a way, I feel that the continuity argument is a red herring issue, and we use it ourselves also to some degree as a rhetorical device to present the field. As you say, there's, and as Fotini would say, by simply looking at her material record, there's plenty of discontinuity, there's plenty of disruption. You could say there's plenty of adaptation. You do not use this word disruption, which brings us before crisis all the time. But at the same time, there's substantial continuity. There are, and I'll stick to text, there are texts that are used for millennia. But again, within that continuity, there is discontinuity, because the way that someone interprets a text from the Roman era in the 11th century and someone might interpret it in the 14th century might adapt to local conditions. Ultimately, texts become parts of much bigger dialogues, and in doing so, they adjust to new realities. Fotini earlier on said that she's interested in bringing Byzantium closer to more modern questions. I think that this is something that the Romans, Byzantines were doing all the time, every time they read a text. They brought it closer to a modern question. If I want to point out a rupture, however, here is that for a very long while, we have treated the use of texts by Byzantine authors as affectation, mimicry, and parroting. Taking those texts and the engagement with those texts seriously and showing how the appropriation of whole segments of someone else's text can mean something very different in different contexts is something that has not always happened in Byzantine studies. So on the reception in general, yeah, I think this is something we're really interested in. This was what I really find interesting in your paper, in trying to basically look at, and we'll come to that tomorrow, to look at an economic text as a pastiche of rhetorical weaponization of other people's language, whether actual quotes or modes of writing about something, in order to present an economic argument. To me, to a Byzantinist, this is completely familiar. And it is convincing, because this is what we see our authors doing. But I'll leave it at that. I don't know whether any of my colleagues have something to say on that. Might we then pass it on to Milena? Milena, are you, oh.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I'm very glad to see you all again, even if it's in 2D, but it's something. And to hear all this talk about the actual sovereignty of the people and the actual very political life of what we call the Byzantine Empire, which was thoroughly political. And I decided to ask questions in the end, because I had questions for every single one of you, so I'd have to filter it and then just ask some of it. But basically, I have to say I'm thrilled, because I haven't heard Fotini before about this political archaeology, and it's a brilliant field of study and of interest. And I don't know where to start, whether from the exile, which is a thoroughly Roman thing, even from Cicero, not just the time of the Principate, or the spaces of the political, from the army to the city, etc., etc. And the gender debate, I think I could talk with Alex for ages. But actually, I have a question for Alex Yovanovich. That's what I settled on, like I'm going to ask Alex. About the whole thing with familial ties between Michael and Frederick and the immersion. So the Byzantine Republic, I think we can all agree, continued to flourish, but it changed significantly in the 11th and 12th centuries, even before 1204. So I've been thinking about this and I have no answer, so I want to know what you think about it. What was the influence, if any, of Slavic and German and Latin paternalistic and familial ways of thinking state and politics on Byzantium? Because from the end of the 11th century onwards, Byzantium starts to become a part of all that kinship alliance that Raffensperger described very well in his book about kinship. But how do you think those things merge, and how it changes Byzantium, and does it change Byzantium in fact?
Yeah, I mean, that's a bit of a question. So first of all, I completely agree with you. We should locate this in the 11th, 12th century, so leave 13th century alone, right? In a sense of being the one that breaks and starts the whole patrimonial kind of mode of operation, and kind of it ends up looking more like in scholarship like the early Ottoman Empire than anything else, which not really, in my opinion. But I think, and this is something, again, you know, I've been talking with Dimitri about a lot. If one should focus on changes, one should not necessarily look just at the patrimonial mode. Rather, one should be looking at the cities and their growing autonomy because of their economic expansion, right? And this happens in Europe as much, in Western Europe as much as it does in Byzantium, from the 11th, 12th centuries onwards, right? And so I agree that Byzantium gets part of this kind of, you know, intermarriage alliances and all that. I mean, just what Manuel I was doing with anyone before him, but what he was doing with his daughter, with the French, with everybody, yes. But having said that, I still don't buy the whole dynastic mode. So yes, there's intermarriage. Yes, there are strong ties. Strong ties were always there. But when you look at the percentage of marriages that happen with Byzantine kind of families in power with other royal families around Europe, it's not as high as among the other families in Europe who have a more stable kind of position within Europe, right? In a sense, a bit more dynastic one, right? So you know you're going to inherit this. And I think we see actually marriages with Byzantium when you go through them for the 12th century. I forgot which scholar did this. She charted all of the marriages between the Byzantines and the French in the 12th century, Southern French nobility. And actually, it's usually the kind of the traditionally well-off families in Byzantium from Constantinople that get married into families, not necessarily the family who's in power. So, for example, the Duque were marrying off for a while, even though they did not really hold the imperial tenure for that long. So I think, again, we should maybe kind of look a bit further down and not just look at the imperial family at the moment who's intermarrying, but rather look at the general elites who are constant in Constantinople, right? Over time, we get families who are there for a century, 2, 3, 4, 5, or whatever they try to claim, and the ones in Europe who are actually, again, there for a while. I think that might be a bit more fruitful than just looking at the big family, at the imperial family that gets intermarried or not, because everybody else is doing it at the same time, and the imperial family just happens to be the imperial family at a time. Similarly to the Holy Roman imperial families in a sense of, you know, they're electoral, right? So if the Hohenstaufens are in power now, it doesn't mean they'll be in power in 50 years. So I think we should focus on that maybe a bit more than just looking at the imperial families and their intermarriages, if that makes sense.
Yeah, perfectly. Thank you.
Fotini, you had a question.
Yeah, Dimitri, you're not going to escape questions about your own talk, obviously. But I just want to say thank you for taking the heat for all the Byzantines with the big questions that are asked from our colleagues. And I will say for Kosti's question, at least, that, you know, although as students of the past, we are very well versed in thinking about how our own experiences and the current events that surround our lives really influence the way we write and we study the past. We usually don't do the same courtesy for the Byzantines, but the Byzantines do that very intentional when they want to emphasize that interruption or that continuity with the past. And when they do that, I think they really want to talk about what's happening currently in their own lives. And we see this materially, whether they are refounding an older monastery or using spolia in their new buildings. There's always a very current agenda for that. And now to you, Dimitris. So I will preface this that I'm only asking this because of your background in political science. So I know you can tell us a little bit more about this idea of political action. In your talk, you're kind of taking us through different scenarios. So what's happening in this idea of the commander being a political man, but also the political nature of the soldiers in civil war, or versus trying to fight an enemy. Only the elite military officials versus soldiers, and then you have the example of the veteran soldier. All these are different different circumstances in which this political interaction is happening. And for me, that means that the political action is not one size that fits all. So I wanted to invite you to comment a little bit of this on how do you see these different types of political actions within that umbrella that you're describing in the army?
Okay, I think that in many ways there is a traditional format for Romans to debate and make decisions on military affairs during campaign, whether it is civil war or non-civil war. And this is the concilium of the commander. And that goes back to the Roman Republic. And the concilium of the commander is basically a space where the commander basically brings his tribunes in, and beyond the tribunes, perhaps centurions, who are these liminal characters in both the command structure, but also in the social structure, because they're well off compared to the rest of the soldiers, but they certainly have the trust of the soldiers by virtue of service. They're from their social background rising up in order to discuss military affairs. So the simple structure of the army is by definition deliberative. And all our sources tell us that these are moments where there is debate, where there is conversation. Now, of course, you can imagine that if on the one hand you had Georgios Maniakis, who for the non-Byzantinists is the closest that the Byzantines got to a berserker in terms of his behavior vis-a-vis others. He punched at some point and killed on the spot someone who pissed him off during an encounter. Obviously, your style of command will be more authoritarian and maybe less consultation will take place. But the idea that there will be some sort of consultation is there. And of course, that consultation is very useful for the commander, because the commander cannot have it guaranteed that he will win. So if the decision has been taken together with others, you spread the blame to. If you win, you're going to be on the chariot during the triumph. But when you lose, well, we were all together in the tent when we were discussing it. Now, our sources, however, tell us that it goes beyond the concilium. And the simple structure of the Roman military camp, and the Byzantines in some ways replicate that, has a commander's tent and the main administrative kind of office is the very center. And there is a structure of streets pretty much like a Hippodamian plan in the camp that leads everyone to a common space where everyone comes together. And they don't just come together for decisions. I mean, they come together for military justice. What is the whole idea of punishing someone publicly? It's delivering justice that takes place on the basis of specific rules for everyone to see that justice has been done at a military context. So our sources tell us that the commanders do not simply constrain themselves to the concilium, but they try to relate that to as many people as possible. And where I think it gets interesting is when you actually start thinking of how these people in the army connect with society. Because the one thing that happens, and here we need to emphasize breaks and continuities, what happens with Islam and with the fact that suddenly from a universal empire, you're just a punching bag for the most powerful state in the world, you have the creation of this intimate link between military families and the rest of the population. At that point, the average soldier expresses opinions about a much broader part of society. If in the military rolls of Byzantium, scholars, even people who disagree, whether it's Holden and Treadgold, for example, who wouldn't be in the same room, would agree that at least 100,000 people belong in the military roles. Not all of them are always active. 100,000 in 10 million, which is what we usually postulate a Middle Byzantine population, is significant. It's a significant percentage of society, essentially especially when you multiply by 4 for the immediate family of the soldier. And you realize that suddenly all these soldiers who we can see as tools in the hands of elite commanders are actually people from very specific backgrounds who especially given the thematic structure of the Byzantine army in the core Middle Byzantine centuries, fight to defend their own hearths. At that stage, things start getting rather intimate in terms of the political expression. And here is, I think, one of the ironies, and it's an irony that has a lot to do with the Byzantine army, but also perhaps with the Byzantine bureaucracy. In that sense, the Byzantine state of the Middle Byzantine period is probably more directly representative than the previous Roman state. It's more cohesive and perhaps more accountable to its population through these tools of communication, a concretized bureaucracy that communicates with the provinces, and then an army that at the same time reflects the opinions of the people from the ground up. Now, you would ask me, of course, okay, I showed you some walls. These are walls of people of a certain social background. I'm doing grassroots stuff. Where is your evidence for these soldiers at the ground level communicating up? And here, frankly, we rely on you guys, on archaeologists, and on you know, the inscriptions in the churches in Asia Minor, and all this work where common soldiers are commemorated in Anatolia who have fought for country and for their fellow villagers. We rely on any kind of monuments talking about the army, but we also rely on the texts, which always in an offhand kind of manner, because it's just, oh, I just throw it in there. And he sent letters to all the villages to get them on his side. What does it mean for a rebel to actually send officers who are persuasive in villages to convince them? How is a village politically active? The image that we have of a medieval village is help, I'm being repressed from Monty Python's. It's not really.
Please read my upcoming book for this.
Okay, I promise I will.
No, thanks. But you know, as you were saying, I mean, I think you're very right. The numbers you gave between how many people are involved directly or indirectly in the army, and how that, you know, trickles down and influences different groups in cities and villages. And I think, you know, the other way we can think about this, or at least it helps me think about this impact of things that I hadn't thought so much before, has to do with networks. So, you know, trying to visualize the social networks of interaction, and actually, you know, the studies that have been made, for example, how networks work in order to convince people to vote in the States. So it's very much how, you know, weak ties and actually not your closest friends, but some of your wider circle can have a much stronger impact in convincing you to vote than your friend or your family. So, you know, I think there's something to that, you know, direction of thinking actually how that back and forth, that communication between different parts of the army and different parts of the civic society, let's say, kind of meet in order to decide politics. I hadn't thought about this before, but thanks. Yeah. Thanks.
And to continue on a bit on the Tiffany speculation, creative historical speculation thing, but I think it's a valuable tool here. What does it mean to have in the village a person who is missing a limb and who everyone knows lost that limb during battle? What does this do for the forging of an identity in that village? You don't need to have an actual active soldier to be generating ideas about who we are, where do we belong, what do we do. Humans themselves become monuments, and your veterans, in this case, and there would have been quite a few, become either speaking or non-speaking monuments simply by moving around a village. And here we need to think of these dynamics in the same way that you think about streets and what a door might do to a space. What does the guy sitting on the side because they cannot cultivate their land, they're mostly inactive, do for the identity of a village as a member of a broader Roman political community?
Chapter 3.
Excellent. So I want to thank everyone for staying with us for so long and contributing with questions. questions, and hopefully opening up a set of questions that may be followed tomorrow as we actually go to some foundational texts and questions on the constitution of a political community at a global context. As we disband and go towards drinking, lunch, whatever it is that we will do in our different time zones, I would like to ask Yorgos and Kostis perhaps to stay on just to discuss some modalities for tomorrow, and to renew our appointment for tomorrow morning with everyone else. I really thank you for what, in the absence of Uzo and C, was a very vibrant conversation, and I hope interesting for people. Thanks.